Badlands has got to be one of the most impressive debut films ever made. I know not everybody loves Terrence Malick, especially some of his more recent work, but you have to give him some credit for bursting onto the scene with a true piece of American art house cinema that I think was deeply influential. By the way, he followed this up with Days of Heaven, and then took a short 20-year break before releasing The Thin Red Line. Since Terrence Malick, Martin Sheen, Sissy Spacek all went on to have big careers, it's easy to forget that in 1973, none of them were particularly well known. Martin Sheen was 32, and he'd already been in Catch-22, but his most iconic roles were still ahead of him. Only in America could a serial killer go on to be the president of the United States. Only in Hollywood. Usually when I use the term shoestring on this channel in relation to the budget of a film, I'm talking about where things started to go wrong, but that's not the case here. It was not easy to make an independent film in 1973, and this production had all kinds of problems, but Malick came up with something so good that you might not even realize the constraints he was working under, and it almost doesn't make sense to talk about this film as a low-budget film or a debut or this small production. It feels like a big movie. Having said this, I'm not head over heels about Badlands. Well, I don't know. It's a complicated movie. I'm not sure I would recommend it to everyone. It does some really cool things, some subtle things. It's way ahead of its time in certain ways, but maybe it's also a bit confounding in certain ways. The pacing is kind of weird. You might wonder, what's the point of this movie? I think just about everybody will feel that this movie has an aura and an aesthetic, but is there more to it than that? I think so, but it's hard to put into words just what is so special about Badlands. Nonetheless, I will try. First, let's talk about some of the other movies available on the market. Badlands is about a pair of young lovers who go on a killing spree. The first thing that comes to mind here is probably Bonnie and Clyde, which came out in 1967. More than the similarities in subject matter, I think the interesting thing here is how these movies use anti-heroes and violence. Bonnie and Clyde was a bit of a landmark film in Hollywood's journey away from the production code, away from the very strict moralistic guidelines about what you could show in a movie and what you could not. Bonnie and Clyde romanticizes crime in a sort of doomed escapism that perhaps you can stretch into a metaphor about subverting the American mainstream, or maybe just about being young. Badlands does the same thing. It may be telling that these are both rural period pieces as well. Terrence Malick was actually quite close to Arthur Penn, who directed Bonnie and Clyde. He worked for him at times, and he thanks him in the credits of Badlands. It seems like there's some obvious influence here. Actually, though, I think there's another movie that is even more useful for thinking about Badlands. I'm talking about the 1965 Jean-Luc Godard film, Pierrot le Fou. This is also a film about a young couple facing some kind of disillusionment and hitting the road. There is a certain childishness and an inclination towards self-destruction that you also find in Badlands. I was really struck by the scenes where Kit and Holly are hiding out in the forest. They build a big treehouse, they read, they dance. It's a return to childhood, and not just for Holly. Kit has a chance to play soldier. He's running around with his shirt off, perhaps presaging a future role from Martin Sheen. No, not Josiah Bartlett. This is probably not the kind of behavior you would expect from fiendish criminals on the run. This movie is loosely based on a true story of infamous crooks, but I don't think of it as a historical film exactly. It doesn't shove the time period into your face. It doesn't rigorously chronicle the events. I think more than anything, it's a personal film, and these moments in the woods are a deeply personal moment. Seeing these people essentially as children is an interesting angle of this. Movie. These scenes in the woods reminded me a lot of Pierrot le Fou. The couple there spend some time acting out different French stories. They're hanging out on the beach, I think. I'm not going to try to get out the shoehorn, but I think it's clear that at a high level, this movie, Badlands, is a modern film. And more specifically, maybe it shares a certain narrative fascination with the new wave. Throughout the movie, Holly contemplates the course of her life. She wonders, where is it going? How did she end up where she is? There's a disconnected feeling to all of this, as if she isn't the one living her life, or that it is shaped by outside powers. There's also a sense that her circumstances are only one of many possibilities. This is quite different from the ideas of classic Hollywood, where characters are predestined for self-actualization. Of course, by 1973, classic Hollywood was disappearing in the rearview mirror, and there were a lot of stories about the young and the restless. Is this your typical 1970s movie, though? I'm not sure. In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. Another thing that stuck out to me about some of these scenes in the woods or some of these scenes later in the car, some of these contemplations of life, was how much media sneaks into these moments. For instance, Kit is compared to James Dean several times. Holly reads the book Kon-Tiki when she's in the wood. Later, she reads some Hollywood trade magazines. She reads some trivia about film stars. It can feel a bit weird for Hollywood to acknowledge itself in a movie. I mean, what if someone walked up to Kit and said, hey, you know who you look like? Martin Sheen. Of course, the movie's set in the 50s, so I'm not sure he would have been alive or known yet. But again, there's sort of the disappearance of Hollywood in film. Again, the presence of this media here reminds me a bit of Pierrot Le Fou. Fundamentally, I think what is happening is that these worldly media throw some gas onto the fire regarding this question of personal agency. Where are we headed? Why are we where we are? It's kind of alienating to read these books, to watch movies. I guess a simpler way to put it is that unlike the classic film, unlike the classic Hollywood formula where people are predestined to become the boldest and brightest version of themselves, Badlands plays that tape in reverse, with Kit and Holly beginning as lovers, but heading towards something nebulous, uncertain, arbitrary in some ways. Also, in the mix there is some enunciation of American culture, the storylines and narratives of American media and Americana, and how these things kind of intersect. I think this kind of relatable. It's a relatable feeling for people. The vacuuming of fantasy out from one's identity. Where does it leave you? Surely that's part of growing up to some extent. I am reminded of those scenes where Kit and Holly race through the desert. They're not on the roads. They're plowing through the dust all alone in this Cadillac. A simple thing, but how might that relate to the way people live on their own? Anyway, we kind of jumped into the deep end there a little bit. Like I said, I think there's some new wave influence in this. There's also some clear influence of earlier Hollywood films, but this is a modern film. This is a modern film, without a doubt. Let's take a step back, though, and talk a little bit about the production. Like I said, this movie had a tiny budget. There are a number of shots that look grainy or even a bit out of focus, but don't worry, the cinematography is still evocative. I think this movie was ahead of its time in terms of narrative devices and aesthetic devices. The way it's narrated and scored reminds me of a bespoke movie of the early 2000s, maybe something by Peter Greenaway or, dare I say it, Wes Anderson. In some ways, I think it's hard to believe that Badlands is from 1973. In other ways, it does feel kind of old. Kit and Holly are traveling through a world that I don't think exists anymore. The film is steeped in Americana, which is potent overall, but there are some details that were foreign to me. I think another virtue of the movie is how raw it is at times. There's a scene where Kit records a tape on a dictaphone. I guess we'd call it a voice note today. There's something about this that just feels real in a almost a haunting way. Martin Sheen almost looks at the camera at one point. There's some great writing in this movie, these raw moments, but there are also profound moments that aren't too overblown. There's voiceover, but it isn't obnoxious. Actually, it's interesting that the story here is told by Holly. You might expect Kit to be the main character in some ways, but the story starts with Holly's voice and an image of her with a big dog. There's a number of dogs in the film, especially the beginning, actually. Potentially a metaphor for you to chew on. Might Kit be a canine of his own? Who knows? On the surface, maybe Holly seems meek. When Kit first meets her, he touts himself as someone who always has something to say. Isn't that lucky? Maybe, maybe not. Holly's narration balances things out. It turns out she has a lot going on inside as well. I think Days of Heaven is also narrated by a woman, but my memory of that movie is a bit fuzzy. Voiceover can be a red flag, but here it seems to work out. Terrence Malick wrote the film as well as directing it and producing it, and I think he did a good job. Sometimes Malick is thought of as self-indulgent. That might be the main criticism of his career, but this movie is actually pretty restrained, I thought. I think there are some pitfalls in Badlands. It's paced somewhat strangely. If you're expecting an action movie or a period piece, you might be disappointed. It's hard to put your finger on this movie's chief virtues. I think one of them is emotional coherence. Forget the story and the facts. This is an evocative movie, and I'm not talking about happy or sad. This is a movie that stirs up some complex emotions and memories. You can almost see its different sections as different paintings or different poems. Overused comparisons, perhaps, but maybe it makes sense. Terrence Malick does this in a lot of movies, focuses on evoking things, and maybe he takes things way too far in some recent work like The Tree of Life, which seems to operate almost entirely by evocation and have, I won't get into it, but it's not clear if there's anything else in that movie. I'm not sure if evocation is a word, but you get the idea. There is something poetic about this movie. I hesitate to say that because what does it mean? Let me leave you with a few details that stuck out to me, at least. Holly's father is a sign painter. I love this aspect. There's a great scene where Kit asks him for permission to date his daughter or something like that. The father's out painting this huge billboard in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of a garish ad. There's a hole in the middle of it for some reason. Kit says, "Sir, do you mind if I lean on your Willis?" That's a type of car. And we can intellectualize about this scene, talk about advertising and capitalism, employment, right? Employment is there's a scene in the unemployment office earlier. It's a kind of a pivotal thing in some ways. Americana all over the place here. Pastoralism, right? He's out in the middle of nowhere. There's a generational schism. Car culture, of course, is a big piece. By the way, notice how the oil industry shows up in this movie. Just like in Five Easy Pieces and The Last Picture Show, two other big movies from a similar time period. There are quite a few details in this movie, but I'm not sure how much they matter. I like the scene mainly because of the feeling. Kit is this bristly younger man with all kinds of bravado, but he calls Holly's dad sir, probably more out of strategy than out of respect. There's all kinds of tension here, or maybe reluctance is a better word. Holly's dad doesn't have much to say. He's settled into his hegemonic role in society. He doesn't want to adjust. He's not really interested in thinking about other perspectives. He's got it made, even if that means painting kind of cheesy ads on the side of a billboard. Anyway, I'm reminded of when I had a particularly bad professor in college, a philosophy professor, who gave me a poor mark on an essay, even though it was somewhat clear that she hadn't read it. I went to her office hours to ask her about this, and there she was, painting a billboard. It was this experience, really. And I fault myself, perhaps, in some ways, for how it played out. This movie isn't about my life, but it's strangely universal. I think we can generalize some. Like one of the things in here that is interesting is that there's no mutual interest between these characters. There's no interest in connection. There's no interest in actually reaching out exactly. There's a mutual lack of respect. It's interesting to see throughout the movie who Kit and Holly connect with because they're quite personable. At least Kit, he tries to strike up a conversation or a relationship. Well, a conversation with just about every one that they meet on their travels. Of course, he goes on to shoot some of them. This fickleness of connection and its relationship to all this uncertainty and alienation we talked about before. The fickleness of connection in America is maybe one of these things here. Maybe that's a way to try and put some of these poetic ideas into words, but I'm not sure that really makes that much sense for this movie. And I don't think you have to do it to take something profound from Badlands. This is a film with tremendous emotional depth. Although, ironically, it's not a deeply moving film in some ways, I don't think. It's a movie that can stir up, like I said, some complex emotions and memories. At this point, I think I've rambled long enough. Malick can be a puzzling director, but Badlands is probably one of his easiest films to watch. Still, maybe some of its virtues are a bit clandestine, but if you haven't seen it, you should take a look.